Ibere. How did sand end up in the deserts if it never rains there? Shouldn't there be no soil erosion? You know it, right? This is such a great question that I'm saving it for the end of the video, but stay tuned. There are other ones just as interesting. Want to see? Why do we shout Jeronimo when jumping from a high place, like into a pool? I always thought this was a Brazilian tradition. In fact, some people asked if in other countries there isn't, like, another name that people shout when they jump. And I always thought it had something to do with Jeronimo, the hero of the Backlands. Something like that, from a soap opera that aired when I was a kid. It was a rerun on the SBT channel of a soap opera from the early 80s. Imagine an old weird recording, but it's unrelated. The real story is way cooler. This tradition was born in the United States among Army paratroopers. There was a guy there who, when it was time to jump, shouted Jeronimo, and it caught on. The story goes that the day before, they all watched the recently released movie called Jeronimo together. And there was a very brave guy in that movie, and somehow he was challenged. They said he didn't have the guts to jump. He said he'd shout Jeronimo as he jumped, and he did. But what I really found cool about this story is that this guy Jeronimo was actually a real indigenous leader, an Apache leader from North America. Originally, the area he lived in belonged to Mexico. Belonged in quotes, right? Because they were there long before any Spanish colonizer. But then, the forces of Mexico, the Mexican army, started attacking these indigenous people. And in one of those attacks, his mother, his wife, and his 3 children were killed. You can imagine that after that, this guy didn't stay very calm at all. Soon after, the United States took these lands. Jeronimo, who once fought Mexicans, began fighting Americans. He was fierce and extremely hard to capture. He was caught a few times, escaped, but would gather a group again. But around 60, he surrendered and was captured. This guy then was a prisoner of war for 23 years. And when he died, he said he deeply regretted surrendering because he thought he should have fought until the end. So, next time you shout Jeronimo to jump into the pool, know that it has a much bigger meaning than you thought. Raphael, a channel member. We always guarantee a question for members here. Since the planet spins and we have centripetal force, do people at the equator weigh less? Does this question make sense? Every question makes sense. Look at this. Imagine the planet spinning. Whoever is on the equator is moving at a speed of about 1,000 to 1,056 miles per hour. But anyone at the pole is essentially standing still in relation to the Earth's rotation. So, theoretically, there's a tendency for those near the equator to be thrown out into space because of that inertia and the momentum the person got by spinning with the planet. As you're asked, this should make some sense when a person steps on a scale. And yes, it does make sense. If someone is at the equator and steps on a scale, they'll weigh less than a person who's at the pole. And for 2 different reasons. The first, which has less influence, is that the planet Earth is slightly flattened. So, those at the pole are closer to the center of the Earth. They're closer to the Earth's center of mass, right? The equilibrium point is where the weight is theoretically concentrated. So, people at the pole are more attracted by gravity than those here at the equator. But this second effect of the outward force from Earth's rotation also makes a difference. In the end, people here at the equator will have a weight difference of about 0.4%, more or less. So, I weigh 187 pounds, that would be 187 times 0.004, around 12 ounces. But there's something kind of sad about that. For us who live in Brazil, because our country, in general, is kind of close to the equator. So we already weigh less because of that. If you're from Porto Alegre and weigh yourself in Macapí on the equator, the difference will be very small. It's not that much. I've got a silly question. Well, you're in the right place. Let's go. If it were possible to touch a lightning bolt without getting electrocuted, what would it feel like? The sensation would be horrible. The temperature of a lightning bolt is about 54,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 5 times hotter than the surface of the sun. Just so you have an idea, the material that withstands the most heat before melting is a tantalum hafnium carbon alloy, which can handle up to 7,619 degrees Fahrenheit. So, if you touched a lightning bolt, your hand would probably evaporate and you wouldn't see anything anymore. Why is it that when we call someone ordinary in Brazil, It's an insult, but extraordinary is a compliment. And if ordinary is bad, then extraordinary should be really bad, right? But it's not. Ordinary isn't necessarily bad. Ordinary simply means common. Ordinary. It's something you see every day. That's very easy. That exists a lot. But we usually use it in a negative way. That's ordinary, meaning it's very common. The same thing happens with mediocre. Mediocre means that it's average, that it's like the others, that it's just standard. We use it to say something is bad, likely because people feel superior to average, making mediocrity seem negative. But what about the extra before extraordinary, right? The extra doesn't mean very. The extra means that it's outside. Extra means that it's beyond. So, extraordinary means that it's not ordinary, that it's beyond ordinary, that it's better than ordinary, that it's above ordinary. Extraordinary is someone who is not common, who is above average, who is better than others. What would happen if an astronaut fired a gun in space with no gravity and no air resistance? First thing, there's no such thing as no gravity. Gravity exists everywhere in the universe. The difference is that in orbit around a celestial body, you don't feel its gravity. So, on Earth, when astronauts are there on the International Space Station orbiting around the Earth, they don't feel Earth's gravity. It's like Earth's gravity isn't present. They don't feel the sun's gravity either, since they're orbiting it. So, yes, gravity exists. In fact, if you shoot, it will make a difference because of gravity. Let me explain. The first thing is that the ammunition will work because it has all the chemical ingredients there to explode and push the lead forward. So, the gunpowder that's there and everything else has the necessary oxygen to burn and expel the lead. This projectile will come out at a very high speed and won't be stopped by anything. So the thing just goes flying away. And it can go into orbit, for example, around a planet, the sun, or something like that. So gravity at that moment is going to make a big difference. It may orbit a celestial body, and depending on how it was launched, might even crash into it. But yes, it can travel through space for many, many centuries. Millennium, Billa. Millennium? I don't know. But something really cool is going to happen. Imagine that this astronaut is floating in space. Okay? He's not attached to anything. He's just floating there. And at the moment, the bullet is pushed forward. He's pushed backward. Of course, the bullet has much less mass than the astronaut. So it goes out super fast, and the astronaut is thrown backward with some force. And then you have the same problem as with the lead. The lead goes infinitely forward. The astronaut also goes infinitely backward. So, if he fires this shot and is floating in space, he'll probably drift away from the ship and never come back unless someone goes after him. But it's worse than that. The impact from the gun, that recoil, won't be applied right in the middle of the astronaut. So he goes straight backward. It'll probably be applied higher up. So it'd be like this. Look. The astronaut will start moving backward while spinning, and he'll keep spinning forever in space. Why does the heart beat faster when we're nervous? That's really cool. There's something called the fight or flight response. That comes from the time when we lived in the forest with other animals, when we were in a dangerous situation. Like, I don't know, a jaguar would show up, or some fiercer animal, right? A peccary, that wild pig, or even a person trying to attack us. Your body would start getting ready, either to run away or to fight. And for that, you have to be physically prepared. Your body has to make some changes. So, the first thing is to release a hormone called adrenaline, and it's going to cause these changes. Let's see. There's a list here. Look, the heart will beat faster than normal to pump more blood to the muscles, to the brain, and so on. So, if you measure the heartbeat, it will be faster. There will also be more pressure. The person will also breathe faster. The airways open up, which is to let more oxygen in, and you'll be able to consume more oxygen in your cells. The cells will all work faster. Vision, hearing, and the other senses become sharper. And the body also releases more sugar into the blood, so you can consume a lot of it and have lots of energy for this dangerous moment. Pretty cool, right? And it all happens very quickly. But here's the problem. We don't live in the forest anymore, and we don't usually have this need to fight or flight so often, and your body still reacts, now to different triggers. So, I don't know, you open an email from someone who was rude to you. That whole system kicks in. Everything I mentioned will happen, but unnecessarily. Or, I don't know, you're stuck in traffic and there's nothing you can do. You start getting nervous, and all of this happens.
If you have these reactions too often, unnecessarily, your body starts to have problems.
You'll have chronic stress, you'll have heart problems, and so on. Because our bodies weren't made to be on this kind of alert all the time, especially without using it afterward. So that's why the heart beats faster in several situations when we get scared, afraid, or anxious.
But ideally, this should happen less often overall.
Why do we feel itchy just by hearing the word lice?
That's true. It happens all over the world. In fact, in English, there's an expression called phantom lice, meaning imaginary lice.
That weird feeling you get when you hear about lice.
That's a type of tactile hallucination. You feel something that isn't really there.
We can also call it tingling or formication. This usually happens to people who have already had lice. Remember that horrible feeling of scratching your head? When you talk about lice, it already triggers something, and you start to itch. You start to feel it. It's similar to what would happen if you eat something that makes you sick.
Just by remembering the food, you'd start to feel sick again.
I didn't find that information, but it's probably a defense mechanism, so we don't get lice again. You don't want to feel that again.
However, this issue can be much more serious, especially during drug withdrawal. For example,
they snorted a lot of cocaine. Now they're trying to get out of it and starts missing the drug. They may have the sensation of insects crawling on their body, under their skin, and so on. And then it's a much more serious problem than just scratching your head. Ibere, why do we feel more powerful when we switch to first gear on a bike? Where does this magic come from? This strength feels endless. It comes from nowhere.
This is a simplified bicycle. The yellow part is the wheel, which touches the ground.
Here we have the sprocket, which is the same size as the chainring here in the front. So the moment you pedal the bike once, the wheel will turn once as well. Because this white part is exactly the same size as this one. If you pedal once, the whole wheel turns once too. Now, let's suppose you're riding on flat ground and everything is fine. Then you reach a steep uphill where you need to push harder. Wouldn't it be nice if you pedaled more and the wheel turned less? Because this way, every time you pedaled, the wheel wouldn't turn once. It'd spin half of a turn or maybe a quarter of a turn. That would make the bike slower, but at the same time, it'd make you stronger because with each pedal stroke, you go a shorter distance. The solution then is to make it smaller right here in the front. We can put a much smaller chainring. In this case, you'll have to pedal several times for the wheel to turn just once. It's like taking tiny steps uphill. It makes you stronger but also slows you down. Of course, when going downhill and wanting to go faster, you do the reverse.
Here, you use a large front chainring and a small rear cog.
And then you pedal once and the wheel spins several times. Of course, the bike will feel heavy. It's much harder to pedal like this.
But if you're going fast or going downhill, you'll need this to get a lot of speed.
The best part is, it's a mechanic's big secret.
It's going to be something very similar when we talk about cars' gears. It has the same logic. In a high gear, like fifth gear, for example, the engine will turn a few times, and the wheel will spin many times.
In first gear, it's the opposite. The engine spins many times, and the wheel spins only a few times. There will be a more complex gear system here to make this happen. Why do we mention Jericho when an idea is bad? In fact, a Jericho idea is something that, from time to time, we have here at Manual of the World. Actually, yesterday I got stuck to a wall here with masking tape, which really was a very bad idea. Jericho is nothing more than a synonym for donkey, for mule, for jackass in Portuguese, which are all adjectives we also use to say that things are kind of dumb.
It's kind of weak-minded, something that doesn't make much sense.
I'm not discussing the difference between a donkey and a jackass, okay? Because the jackass...
If a donkey breeds with a horse, it produces a mule. Some also use mule to mean jackass.
Anyway, that gray animal with a stripe on its back, the funny one in Shrek, is Shrek's best friend. Is this animal really dumb or clumsy, less intelligent than others? That story is old.
For reference, there are many Aesop's fables, who was a Greek writer who lived about 600 years before Christ, where he already put the donkey in that position.
As a dumb animal, an unintelligent animal who always did things wrong. When researching this animal's intelligence, I found out that donkeys aren't dumb. Their name might suggest otherwise, but they're actually quite intelligent.
What happens is that it's a rebellious animal. It doesn't really like to obey human orders.
So, sometimes, for example, the burro just stops. If the burro is pulling something, it stops. It doesn't want to move.
And if you try to train a burro, it's also an animal that's harder to train.
Donkey aren't dumb, they're just rebellious. So, if you ever have a Jericho's idea, maybe it's just simply a rebellious thought. Can you make soda with gases other than carbon dioxide? That question may seem silly, but it's actually a good one. First off, what is this carbon dioxide thing? Those bubbles you see in soda are carbon dioxide. It's a gas that's in our atmosphere, very common for humans. And it brings some pleasure while drinking the beverage. In soda, the carbon dioxide is added by force, okay? You take cold water, inject carbon dioxide, shake it, and the soda gets those bubbles. The carbon dioxide stays dissolved in the water. When you open the bottle, it gradually escapes. In fact, part of it turns into carbonic acid,
which comes from the reaction between carbon dioxide and water. Long before soda, we drank other carbonated drinks like beer. The carbon dioxide in beer comes from fermenting grains, specifically the malt. It's a fermentation that keeps releasing carbon dioxide.
The same thing happens with grapes in sparkling wine. Microorganisms keep eating the sugar from the grapes and releasing their little burps of carbon dioxide, and the drink gets all bubbly. It's a really cool gas. First, because it's not toxic to humans, you can drink it without any problem. Second, because it makes the drink more acidic. We like to drink acidic things. Lemonade, soda, they're all acidic. Third, these bubbles, somehow, are pleasant. They bring a sense of freshness, give pleasure, and create foam on top of what we're drinking. And we love that. And carbon dioxide is also a cheap gas. If you need to inject it into a drink, like in soda, it's an easier gas to find. That being said, I haven't found any soda that uses another type of gas. But I did find a beer that uses nitrogen. But Iberé, nitrogen, that poisonous, explosive, dangerous gas? No. In the case of nitrogen, there's no problem at all. 78% of the air is made up of nitrogen, not oxygen. Oxygen is a much smaller part. So what do they do with this beer? There's a special little machine that you attach to the can. When you pour the beer, it injects nitrogen, mixes it in, and creates a special foam that, theoretically, has a nicer consistency than the one made with carbon dioxide.
I have to admit I felt like trying it, but I think it's all just like a ritual. Something just to make a fuss, rather than something that will actually make a difference in the taste.
Why do things turn black when they burn? That's really cool.
Usually, when we burn something, that thing has an organic origin. It means that at some point, this was alive.
It could be from petroleum. It could be wood or paper, for example, like this matchstick. It's made of pine wood. And as it's burning,
it's really turning black. It's turning completely black. And what's happening here?
This black part is the carbon that's present in not almost, but in all living things. They have a lot of carbon. When you burn it, the fire breaks it down.
It removes many things, but the burning is often incomplete.
It can't burn all the carbon that's there. So, what's left is basically the chemical element carbon, and it's black most of the time. Soot is all carbon, charcoal is carbon, but carbon can exist in other forms. Diamond, for example, is also carbon, and it's completely transparent. This difference in color happens because the arrangement of the atoms is different. So, light behaves differently, depending on that arrangement. Iberé looks at a vinyl record under the microscope and shows the grooves where the music is recorded. My God, what a coincidence! Right next to me, at this very moment, there are vinyl records under a microscope. Before we take a look, let me just explain the secret behind this, okay? How is music recorded onto a record?
Sound is a vibration in the air, and inside our ear, there's a kind of little membrane, like a tiny speaker, which we call the eardrum. So, when the eardrum vibrates, we hear something. To play sound, to play music somewhere, the speaker moves in exactly the same way, right? It moves forward, it moves backward, just like the eardrum does. So, it kind of makes a movement that the eardrum will copy, because this shaking, this vibration in the air, will get there.
And look how brilliant the record is. It has several grooves that work like a trench, a hole where a needle passes through. And this needle keeps dancing.
It keeps vibrating. And do you know how it vibrates?
Yes, exactly the same movement that the speaker makes and that your eardrum makes. This one is a 78 revolutions per minute record. It's really old, and its grooves, the ditches, are bigger. At that time, technology for making bigger grooves didn't exist.
So, what I'm going to look at under the microscope now is this record at first.
Ah, here's its edge, but let's adjust the light. I can just, wow.
It's strange to see this up close. We can see the paths and realize that these paths aren't straight, right? They're all kind of curved. There's a lot of variation here. If it were a road, it would be entirely winding road.
Because the needle will keep zigzagging. And that's what will determine what the record is playing.
Now, I've always wanted to see the other record, this newer record, which is bigger, because its grooves, these paths, are much smaller.
But I don't think I can put it under the microscope. Maybe we'll have to make a sacrifice here with the record. Let's see if it works without destroying the record. Wow, it works. And you can see that the record is much more delicate.
Look, the grooves are really thin. This wider groove that just appeared here is the separation between one song and another.
They included this so we can see it on the record, right? It shows where each song is, and it also adds a pause. Look at this, and I didn't have to scratch the record.
By the way, when you scratch the record, that path gets messed up, as if you opened a road there.
And at the moment the needle is passing, it can jump from one path to another.
Then you lose part of the song, or the record gets stuck.
The needle keeps going back to the same path, and then it keeps playing the same part of the song over and over. That's really annoying.
When I was a kid and someone would repeat the same thing over and over, we'd say that person had their record stuck.
Why does stale bread in a plastic bag stay soft, while stale bread in a paper bag gets hard?
We must first imagine bread at the moment it bakes. It will be crunchy on the outside because it's dry on the outside. It got heated more on the outside.
And on the inside, it will be soft because it's moist as it baked less. And there's a lot of water in the center of the bread. That moisture will eventually spread throughout the whole bread. That's why bread is only crunchy like that and soft inside right after it's baked. Throughout the day, it becomes more uniform. Overall, the bread gets softer.
If you leave this bread out of the bag or in a paper bag, that moisture will go away.
The next day, the bread is dry and hard, but if you wrap it in a plastic bag, it keeps its moisture.
And that's why the next day it's still soft. Of course, after a while, it will get kind of rubbery. But anyway.
That's why bread inside a plastic bag stays softer than bread that's just in a paper bag. Why is it that about an hour before sunrise, the temperature is at its lowest point during the night? It's true. If you check the weather forecast, let me take a look here and record the phone screen. Look here. The minimum temperature happened exactly at 6 in the morning, which is the time when the sun is rising, right at the moment the sun is coming up. Why is this the coldest time? Shouldn't the coldest time be midnight since it's the middle of the night?
What we have to think about is that when the sun comes up, it starts to warm the ground. The ground keeps getting warmer throughout the whole day. So, around 3 in the afternoon, there's a lot of sun. It's still really strong. The ground has already gotten really warm, and this is likely the hottest part of the day. Then the sun starts to go down. We no longer have all that energy coming from the sun, but the ground is still warm,
and it'll gradually cool down. So, when it's midnight, it's already cooled down, maybe halfway. It starts to get really cold, but this keeps going. It's getting colder as the ground keeps losing heat, until it gets to around 5:30, 6 in the morning. It's freezing, because we haven't seen the sun for almost 12 hours. Here in Brazil, I mean. At that moment, there will also be a chilly breeze, but why? Picture that the sun has already risen here, okay? The sun has risen in a neighboring region, making it warmer there than here, where it hasn't arrived yet. So, over there, the warmer air rises because it's hotter. When the air rises, the place where you are, the air where you are, tries to replace the other air.
There will be a wind, there will be a little breeze in the early morning, which is also cold. And all of this will stop happening exactly at the moment when the sunlight hits anywhere near you.
Everything will start to warm up and the cycle begins again. I've been getting a lot of geography questions, and I have some exciting news to share with you. Eric Bertelli has followed Manual of the World for a long time. Eric, it's a silly question. Even better, let's go. Do vegetables and greens still have life after they're harvested?
Do we eat beings that are still alive? We need to consider what life is, right? Biologically, if life is having functioning cells, being able to reproduce, being able to interact with the environment,
Then most of the vegetables we eat, if you eat them raw, they're still alive. If you think about an onion, a potato, a beet, a carrot, all these things, if you put them in water or put them in soil and water them, they'll start to sprout and will give rise to a new plant, which will be able to flower, produce seeds, and so on. So yes, there's life there. For example, a fruit contains seeds that, when planted, will grow and reproduce, etc., etc., etc. But you also don't need to feel guilty about it because plants don't have consciousness. So they won't feel pain or be afraid of being eaten like a human being would, alright?
if I drop a bar of soap on the floor, does the floor get clean or does the soap get dirty?
I'll answer you with 2 questions, okay? And then you think about it, but very honestly. First, if you get out of the shower without rinsing off, all covered in soap, are you clean or are you dirty? And the second thing, in your house, when something falls on the floor, does it get dirty? What is the maximum altitude that an insect can reach? It's really cool for us to think about that because what changes up there, right? The creature can't just fly off and, I don't know, reach the moon.
You know it can't because at some point along the way, there won't be any air. But what changes as the insect goes higher?
First, the air density. There are fewer and fewer air molecules. There may come a point when the insect can't stay aloft anymore. It flaps its wings, but there are no molecules to push down. That also means there won't be enough air molecules for the insect to breathe. At a certain altitude, breathing becomes extremely difficult. And then there's the temperature, which drops a lot. Up there, it's always really cold. When we sent that capsule to the stratosphere, the thermometers got so cold that they stopped showing any readings. But, having said all that, there's a Guinness World Record for the highest flying insect ever found.
Which is the small tortoiseshell butterfly, the creature you're seeing right now.
It was found at 19,000 feet.
It's interesting to think about it, because humans can go much higher when they're climbing mountains and so on. And then you might think that from this altitude on, there won't be practically any animals, no insects, right?
There won't be any flies there to bother the climbers at the top of Everest.
Give some study tips for getting into University of São Paulo.
Look, I got into University of São Paulo in 2002. I don't know if my tips are very up to date. Actually, I have 2 that I'm sure will make a difference if you take them seriously. First, your biggest enemy won't be that person who studies like crazy at night. Your biggest enemy will be this right here. This right here will call you when you're studying. It'll be like a magnet that pulls your hand. But when you pick it up, it's like kryptonite for Superman. You'll lose focus completely and forget part of what you just studied, because your brain won't be paying attention to what you're studying anymore. So, if I were you, I'd put your phone in another room, okay? In a different place while you're studying, so you can really focus.
You can absolutely sure that this magnet won't work very well. And the second thing is to get used to the exam.
Sitting in a chair at an unfamiliar school to take the entrance exam gives you chills, because everything's new and there are many unfamiliar people around you. Yeah, maybe it's the first time. There's always a first time that you walk into the room to take this exam.
So, all of this can make you really nervous. And one way to make you less nervous is to take previous exams.
If possible, start in your 2nd year of high school before taking the real college entrance exam. Just go and take the exam, pay the fee, and do it. Or, if that's not possible, get last year's exam or one from previous years. Lock yourself in your room and set a timer as if you were taking the real exam. I'm not sure if it's 3, 4, or 5 hours now. I don't know. Anyway,
do it under real college entrance conditions, including time pressure, to get used to it.
what I said applies not only to University of São Paulo, but to any exam or civil service test.
How do you define a car as 1.0, 2.0? How can a car with 3 or 4 cylinders still be called 1.0?
What does 1.0 on the back of the car mean? What do we mean when we call a car 1.0, 1.5, 1.8, or 2.0? This over here is a miniature of a V8 combustion engine, okay? V8 means that the cylinders are in a V shape. The engine's architecture is in a V shape, and 8 because it has 8 cylinders. There are 8 of these small green pieces, right? But the cylinder isn't one of them. This piece is the piston, but the cylinder is the space where the piston moves inside here, right? It's where the piston fits. How does the engine actually work? The moment we put fuel with air in here, with a bit of oxygen, and a spark is released, this fuel will catch fire and push this green part. So, this is happening all the time. There's fuel burning, and because it gets really hot, it expands and ends up pushing the piston, which is the green part. And that's what makes the engine turn. What does this 1.0 mean? It means that this combustion space, this empty space here, where the fuel is going to burn, if you add all of them up, that's what you'll get. 1.0 means the engine's total space adds up to 1 liter for burning fuel. Of course, the bigger this space is, the stronger the engine will be. So, 1.0 engines are usually in weaker cars due to limited space for burning fuel. A 2.0 or 1.8 engine is usually much stronger. And then the number of cylinders doesn't make that much of a difference because you can have large cylinders and just a few of them. Or you can have a bunch of tiny cylinders. What matters is the total space you have to burn the fuel.
Ibre, is it true that we only use 10% of our brain? And if we used 100%, we would be a different being. I used to say this word wrong in Portuguese when I was a kid. After I read it for the first time, I realized it was brain.
It's strange to say it correctly, but it's just brain. And no, we use more than 10%. That was a myth that came up, and it's really annoying, because there are some people who say, wow, if you only use 10% of your brain, if you do this coaching with me, learn a bit of quantum physics, I don't know what else, you'll unlock your brain and use the other 90%. That would mean you could be 10 times smarter than you are today. That's a lie. You can be smarter than you are today if you study a lot. Put your phone aside, like I said, right? Sit your butt down in the chair and study.
But it won't be because you unlock the 90% of your supposedly unused brain. We use our whole brain. Each part has a function, and over time, humans have been studying the brain more and discovering the functions of each region.
We use the whole brain. Why does the flag look like it's moving in the photo of the man on the moon if there's no wind? Did they really make it to the moon? I'm a bit tired of this whole story because these theories that everything was staged and so on are really bad. Let's clarify. First, this is likely the Buzz Aldrin photo you're talking about, where he's next to the American flag that was planted there on the moon. The first time a human being went to the moon in 1969. This flag has something special, which is different from all the other flags. Since they already knew there was no wind on the moon, they put, besides the vertical pole, another rod on top of the flag. If you look closely at the photo, you can see a small horizontal stick supporting the flag. But you might have imagined that a trip to the moon doesn't have much space.
They went there, packed like sardines, and the flag was the same way. A folded flag, all wrinkled.
When they opened the flag, it was wrinkled and stayed that way, as shown in the photo. Because gravity on the moon is only about 1/6 of Earth's, the wrinkles on the flag end up looking bigger, right?
The flag doesn't hang downward as it would here. It stays wrinkled since there's little force pulling it down.
And it's that all wrinkled flag that we see in the photo. National Aeronautics and Space Administration has released videos showing the flag being planted. And you notice that the movement of the flag is really strange because there's not much gravity.
It has that rod on top, all crumpled. So it's a crumpled thing going from one side to the other.
And that ends up giving the false impression that it's fluttering in the wind. But if you look closely, you can clearly see that's not the case. Anyway, we have to tell this story all the time. If you think it'd be cool to have a video just debunking these myths that man didn't land on the moon, we'll make one. It'll be really cool. Please leave it in the comments. Deal?
Why do we classify meat as beef, pork, etc.?
And chicken is just called chicken? After some research, I found that large animals are always classified this way. So, when we refer to horses, for example, it's equine. So this is what's something equine? Equine leather?
Pig is swine, goat is caprine, sheep is ovine, and buffalo is buboline.
But all of these are domestic mammals, and most of them are relatively large in size. And as for the chicken, that doesn't exist.
For chicken, you could say gallinaceous or poultry. But asking for gallinaceous meat or poultry meat would be pretty strange.
Does the word italic, as in italic letters, come from Italy? Italic letters are the ones that lean to the right, right? We usually use them when we want to highlight something. When adding a word in another language to a Portuguese text, use italics. The person who invented italics was actually an Italian named Aldo Manusio, and he owned a printing business.
He printed books, but this was during the Renaissance, around the late 1400s and early 1500s.
And this guy was really important at the time because he published several classic texts that originally came from the Greeks.
And one of the things he did was notice the way people wrote by hand at the time.
Then he created fonts that copied that handwriting style, slanted to the right, and that's when italics appeared. Those letters slanted to the right,
Which, yes, has that name because it came from Italy.
and it's unrelated to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which is actually leaning, because if you look from the opposite side, it might look like it's leaning the other way, right? One great thing about Iberay Asnwares is how much I learn. I discovered this while researching. I had no idea. But if you're older, you'll remember something. When I was about 15 or 20 years old, there were some programs made by a company called Aldus.
There was Aldus Photo Styler, where I learned to edit photos on the computer. It was a competitor to Photoshop.
Then another program was released for editing text and making newspapers. In college, we used to make newspapers with it.
It was called Aldus PageMaker. The Aldus logo was a guy with a kind of beret, a little hat, which I never understood what it meant. It was this guy. In Latin, his name isn't Aldo, but Aldus Manutius.
The name comes from that because, after all, they were programs that had everything to do with graphics, with printing, and so on. Later on, this company was bought by Adobe. That's why, maybe if you're a little younger, you'll remember Adobe PageMaker, and not Aldus PageMaker. I'll explain the meaning of Adobe next time. I think each brand name deserves its own video, because it's super cool. Should a pen be stored standing up with the tip facing up or down? Melissa, my daughter, asked me this question this week. Let's find out. There is a difference between a ballpoint pen and a felt tip pen. The ballpoint pen is this one. It gets its name because it has a little ball at the tip. If you look really closely, there's a tiny ball that's almost impossible to see. When the ink flows down and you're moving the pen across the paper, that little ball spins.
It picks up the ink and transfers it to the paper. With this type of pen, it's best to keep it facing down, because that way the ball always stays moist with ink.
If the ball dries out and runs out of ink, the pen may not work well later. The felt tip pen is this one here. This pen has a more porous tip, and it has a soft filling inside. When I was a kid, we just called it a marker. And most of the time, it's going to be colored and so on. It's the marker people use for coloring Bobby goods. I'm not sure if this also applies to those marker boxes with 249 in them.
But anyway, in general, this type of pen you have to leave it horizontal so that the moisture inside the ink stays distributed throughout the whole pen.
But in general, those that you buy in a box will always stay vertical. I didn't see any warning there to store them horizontally. Anyway, try it out at home and let us know. This pen is odd because it has two tips. If stored upright, the bottom tip stays moist while the top one dries out. It doesn't make much sense. But let's go to our last question. After all, how is there sand in the desert? If sand is made of crushed rocks and there's no erosion, it doesn't rain in the desert.
How does that pile of crushed rocks form?
To begin with, it does rain in the desert. There are very few places on Earth where it hardly ever rains. Every now and then, it rains a little in the desert. They're not 100% dry places. But there's something. It's not the rain that forms sand. It's something else. The desert has an extreme temperature variation. So, during the day, since you don't have anything covering you, no trees for protection, and no water to regulate the temperature, the sun heats the sand, making it unbearably hot. While at night, it's the opposite. You don't have water to retain the temperature, and it cools down very quickly. So, nights in the desert are usually freezing. It's extremely cold. This variation between hot and cold, as you might have imagined, makes the rocks expand. When it gets hot, they swell. When it gets cold, they shrink. This weakens the rocks. Everything starts to crack. until eventually the rock begins to crumble. It's not only the water that will carry away the rock powder, the sand. There's also wind in the desert, which moves this sand and can create dunes and all that.
But despite all that I've said, I think we have a kind of stereotypical view of deserts. What do I mean by that? It's a kind of a standard perception
That everything is very similar in the desert, that usually a desert is going to be a place full of dunes, of sand, and so on, more or less like the Lençóis Maranhenses. And I'll tell you that the first time I went to a desert, in Atacama, which is up in the north of Chile,
I was kind of disappointed because there weren't any dunes.
the desert was kind of like an endless stretch of dirt. There were lots of stones, big rocks, and everything looked a lot like the soil we have here, only extremely dry.
After that, I traveled through California and went to Nevada.
That region has many deserts, including one of the hottest in the world, and I also didn't see any sand there.
So, that means this idea that deserts are full of dunes doesn't apply to all deserts, okay?
I remember seeing a lot of dunes in the Sahara, but I've never been to the Sahara. I've only seen pictures of it. One day, I'll go there and tell you all about my experience with dunes. But anyway, I think it'll be easier to see sand mountains here in the Brazilian Northeast.
But then, how they're formed is a whole different story, alright?
I'll just remind you that everything I said here was researched beforehand from several sources that I'll be leaving down below in the video description. Anyone interested in these topics can find my research sources below. Okay? Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up because it takes a lot of work. First, collecting your questions, and then researching. Thanks, everyone.